Now, Mr. BD,
Afternoon.
you're on screen to me and to council. You're not on screen to anyone else in this room. I have told people this morning, you may have heard, I don't know, that there is an anonymity order which covers you and your evidence, and I'm sure that those here don't want to hear me repeat it again. Just remind you of it. Now, I will ask you to take the oath. You're affirming, so would you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Ms. Fraser-Butt.
Mr. BD, can you see and hear me?
I can, yes.
When you were 8, you had an accident. Can you tell us what happened?
So I was playing in the front driveway of our house and was climbing on the walls and slipped and fell, and as I fell, it turned out some of the chunks of brick on the top of the wall were loose, and I pulled them down on top of my arm and broke my arm.
And what was the nature of the break to your arm?
So I suffered a double compound fracture of both radius and ulnar.
How much blood was involved in the accident?
So there was significant bleeding to the point, well, my father found me in the next door neighbour's front yard with blood spurting out of my arm, and spent a lot of the next day cleaning blood off their path. So that's, my memories of the blood loss.
You underwent surgery at Scarborough General Hospital in September 1975. Do you have any recollection of having a blood transfusion?
I don't know.
And it's right, isn't it, that your father has died and your mother is very elderly and doesn't know you're infected with hepatitis C?
That's right, yes. So my memory of the injury is of seeing the bone sticking out of my arm in hospital, seeing it bleeding excessively, and then being put under and taken into surgery.
And after surgery, how well were you post-surgery?
So I was in surgery for a number of hours that night and then allowed home that night on the condition that they brought me back to fracture clinic the next morning so that they could check the alignment of the bones, by which point there'd been significant further bleeding which had soaked through the plaster cast, but they decided not to replace it at the time because it was too unstable. Afterwards, I remember being laid up for some time and feeling pretty awful, but I think that's to be expected, of an 8-year-old having suffered that trauma.
You also remember getting some flu-like symptoms not long after surgery, is that right?
Yes, it is, yes. But again, I couldn't attest to, whether that was just, I was probably on some fairly hefty painkillers.
How did you come to find out that you had hepatitis C?
So, completely incidental findings. So, I was actually being investigated for a diagnosis of vitiligo in 2013, which I realised I had and went to the hospital to get that diagnosis confirmed. And part of the workup of that was to look at potential autoimmune causes of the vitiligo. So they confirmed the diagnosis and did a raft of blood tests. And at that point, the SPR carrying out the blood tests decided to do hepatitis. Now, I've spoken to her since, and she still doesn't really know why she did it. She said it wouldn't normally be part of the workup for a vitiligo autoimmune raft of tests, but she did it, and it came back positive for hep C.
You've said in your statement that she simply said, let's do the lot.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I've spoken to her since, like I say, and she's not sure what made her do it, but thankfully she did.
You had a follow-up appointment soon after, and also a fibroscan after diagnosis. What was the state of your liver when you had that fibroscan?
Bad, full-on cirrhotic. So my liver function tests at that point were wildly deranged, and I had MRI, CT, I had full radiological skeletal survey, and as you say, fibroscan. And the fibroscan came back with I can't remember the exact KPA figure, but it was around 20, which is anything over 10 is deemed cirrhotic.
And what was your understanding of the seriousness of cirrhotic liver disease? What were you told about how serious things were?
So I have some medical knowledge, so I knew immediately that it was a death sentence, incurable, irreversible, and so my immediate response was, tell me how long I've got.
And what were you told?
I was told 10 to 15 years, and that's 9 years ago.
Can you tell us anything of the impact that had on you, of that news?
Completely devastating. You go from worrying about, have I got vitiligo, and the vanity around how that might affect your appearance, to suddenly that being so far from relevant, it's unbelievable, and your whole world is turned upside down. And suddenly, I was 46 at the time, you're told when you're going to die. So it's pretty devastating.
You were, at that stage, unable to have interferon. Why was that?
So I was profoundly thrombocytopenic, I still am.
And that's that's a low platelet count.
Yes, yeah. And neutropenic, low neutrophils, lymphopenic, low lymphocytes. And so the feeling was that interferon would be, it could probably be supported through hematology, but it would be risky because it's likely to drop my counts even further, and would take an awful lot of support without a guarantee that it would clear the virus. And also at this point, the new directly acting antivirals were on the horizon, so they were starting to make their way through NICE approval. So the decision was made that it was better for me to hang on and hopefully, be able to be treated with one of the new directly acting drugs.
In 2015, you became aware that the European Medicines Agency had licensed Harvoni. What did you then do in relation to that?
So again, I had lots of close contact with my medical team, trying to track the NICE pathway to see how long it was going to be until it was available on the NHS, and then juggled with the idea of self-funding, which was going to cost about 60,000. Each time I kind of came to the conclusion that I wanted to self-fund because I was fully aware that all the time I was still HCV positive, it was causing further damage to my liver. The NICE approval looked like it was only 2 months away each time, and so although knowing that NICE approvals constantly get kicked down the road, then I still kept for a while thinking, no, I'm not going to self-fund. Then eventually made the decision I was going to self-fund, and then a week later NICE approved it.
You'd arranged to borrow the money in June 2015.
Yes, I had.
And you were told that you would receive Harvoni on the NHS shortly after.
Yes, absolutely.
And you started treatment in November 2015.
Yes, so unfortunately there were further delays, and it was another 6 months before I was actually able to start treatment, but got there in the end.
And what was your situation when you received the treatment? How well or unwell were you with it?
So, with the treatment or with the condition?
With the treatment.
So the treatment was, compared to people who've been treated with interferon, it was a cakewalk. So it's only 3 months, and the ribavirin does give you some issues with depression. There was insomnia, but to be honest, I worked through it. I didn't have to take time off work through it, and I still was able to exercise through it. Not very well, but it was okay. To be honest, it was fine.
You cleared the virus, but continue to have 6 monthly FibroScans.
No, so I continue to this day to have 6 monthly ultrasounds to check for hepatocellular carcinoma, and I have 6 monthly blood tests to check my liver function. FibroScan isn't part of routine surveillance. I've had, I think, 2 FibroScans in the 9 years since.
Your infections had a huge impact on you. What do you want to tell us about that?
Well, it has had a massive, at the time, myself and my partner had just decided that we were going to have children, or try and have children, and that the diagnosis literally came weeks after. And at that point, I couldn't cope with the concept of the risk of transmission to my partner, the risk of transmission to in utero to children if that happened, and also I couldn't cope with the idea of not being there to bring up my children and then leaving them fatherless. So that went out of the window. The ongoing impact is it affects every decision you make. Every time you're thinking, shall we go on the dream holiday next year? Half of you is thinking, yes, I need to do it now while I still can. But half of me is also debating internally whether I should do it, because I'm trying to make sure that my partner will be financially secure when I'm gone. It affects every decision.
In terms of the Skipton Fund, in March 2014, you were told about the fund by your treating doctor. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
And at that point, you tried to obtain your records from Scarborough Hospital.
Yeah.
And what were you told by them? What were you told had happened to your records?
That they've been destroyed. So that everyone's records were destroyed on or shortly after their 25th birthday.
Were you required, you were provided with at least one page from Scarborough Hospital in terms of the Accident and Emergency Department, and we're going to look at that document in a moment. When they sent you that, were you required to pay for the limited records they were able to provide you with?
No, I wasn't.
Could we just turn to the document, which is the A&E record, SKIP 5072 _ 006, and it's page 5, I'd like, please, Lawrence. What we can see here on the left is compound fracture, lower left end radius and ulnar, and then on the right, compound fracture of left radius and ulnar, something that's difficult to read, and then a little further down, oh, sorry, if we can go down, please, Lawrence. There's a note that pethidine had been given, and then, however, on-call contacted for advice, sutures to closure of the wound, no vascular or tendon injury, check X-ray in the morning. But that's what's on the A&E record, and that's the only document that you were able to obtain in relation to the entire incident. Is that right?
It is, yes.
When you applied to the Skipton Fund the first time, you were rejected by them.
That's right.
You then reapplied to the EIBSS in 2020, is that right?
Yeah.
And if we can turn to that document, WITN 4211 002, please. And it's page 3 I'd like to start with. we can see here that your application has been declined, and if we go down the page, it says this: our assessors acknowledge that you do have chronic hepatitis C. However, there is no evidence to support a history of transfusion. The assessors stated that it is highly unlikely that a transfusion would have occurred and would not usually be necessary at an operation to repair a broken wrist. You appealed that decision, and I just want to look at the your email in response as your appeal and then ask you about it. If we go back to page 2 of the same document, and it's the paragraph at the bottom, you indicate you wish to appeal, and then you wrote this: it seems clear from the wording of the explanation of the declined claim that the assessors have not read the application properly. They describe it as an operation to repair a broken wrist. If the documentation provided had been read properly, they would see that nowhere is the word wrist mentioned, and to dismiss the injury as such is more than a little insulting. As clearly stated, the injury was a double compound fracture of the radius and ulna. This means that both bones were fractured, and the fractures were in the middle of my forearm. Further, just to clarify, the word compound means that this involved an open wound. This open double fracture led to large loss of blood. My father spent many hours the following day cleaning the blood off the neighbour's path, and the surgery was long and involved. It's my strongly held opinion, and the equally strong assertion of my medical team, that it is highly likely that such a serious injury in a young child would have required blood transfusion, and that this is the cause of my infection with hepatitis C. Thank you, that can come down. That was the email you sent in appeal, and you've referred to the original refusal of your application as more than a little insulting. Can you explain to us how you felt about the original refusal?
Yes, I mean, I think reading that email again, you can almost, my fury is tangible. I think for me, it's not the rejection, it's the manner of the rejection. And to see the words compound fracture of radius and ulna and describe that as a broken wrist is either a panel misunderstanding what the words radius and ulna mean, in which case that panel's not fit for purpose, or that it's a deliberate attempt to diminish the severity of the injury to then subsequently justify a rejection of the appeal. And either way, I don't think that's a panel that's fit for purpose.
And your appeal...
And I was very angry.
And your appeal was rejected again?
Yes. And it was rejected again without any reference whatsoever to my description of, or highlighting of them describing my injury as a broken wrist. Now, I would at the very least have expected them to say, yes, you're right, it doesn't say wrist. I'm sorry about that, it says you had a broken radius and ulna. But there was no acknowledgement of it whatsoever.
I think you were listening into the earlier discussion with the panel this afternoon. And one of the things we talked about was the effect of the rejections on people's mental well-being. Do you have any reflections on that for yourself?
Yes, I mean, I think the main responses I heard earlier were both anger and devastation. Now, I think mine was mainly anger, because I was fully expecting to be rejected, because I was aware anecdotally that the Skipton Fund appeared to be set up to require a level of proof that most people couldn't provide because their records had been destroyed. So I wasn't so much devastated by the rejection, I was angered by the manner of the rejection. It felt patronising and disrespectful to my injury. I would have hoped that they would at least try and understand what had happened and understand the full extent of the injury, and then make an educated, professional assessment of that, perhaps with, recourse to appropriate professionals. They say in their letter that on their panel they've got a liver expert, a haematology expert. Now, my injury was orthopaedic. So to reject on the basis that I would hope that a panel like this, to function properly, would perhaps canvass the opinion of one or two paediatric orthopaedic surgeons, preferably ones who had experience of treatment protocols in the 70s, and say to them, do you think a transfusion is likely in that circumstance? Now we have all the details of that injury. And there is very little effort made, in my opinion.
That was something that the panel also discussed earlier this afternoon, of the question of the Skipton Fund being more proactive in terms of obtaining information and obtaining records. Do you have any reflections on that part of our discussion?
So, yeah, I agree with what they said entirely, that in an ideal world, we wouldn't be expected to retrieve the records ourselves, because you hunt around and you don't know where those records are. You don't know whether you've asked the right questions to the right people. And it would be very good if you knew that that was being done on your behalf. Now, in retrospect, knowing what I know now about the way that they acted, I wouldn't trust them to do it. So, that's the dichotomy, is that if the Skipton Fund said, oh, we've tried and we couldn't find your records, after the treatment of that and the EIBSS support scheme, I'm not sure that I would trust them to do it. That is how low my opinion of that fund has got.
And in terms of records and the difficulties in finding records, you were obviously told that the majority had been destroyed. What are your thoughts on record keeping and the ability to access them?
So, the NHS's record keeping has for a long time been shambolic, and I think this demonstrates it very, very amply. I was shocked that when I found out that all my records had been destroyed, because I don't know whether I was just naive, but I wasn't aware of that as a policy. And I do think that an organisation fit for purpose would probably have asked consent of the patients and said, this is our plan. If you wish to retain these records, you need to do it yourself. But at least give you the opportunity, as one of the panel said earlier, to keep the records yourself, because you don't know when you might need them. But, all that being said, they've probably been sitting in cardboard boxes at 6 different hospitals for all sorts of years. So how much use they would have been and how traceable they would have been, I don't know anyway.
And with that dispersion of records in multiple different locations, do you have any reflections on what a different system might look like?
So obviously digitisation has made all that much easier and hopefully now much better. NHS hospitals have always worked in silos, and they still to quite an extent do. So the cross-fertilisation of data and information is wanting, and it was very poor then. We're going back to the 70s. It was appallingly bad. But one of the panel did make the point earlier on that in a lot of industries, their record keeping has to be pristine. And the NHS seems to be able to get away with writing very perfunctory notes in a completely illegible way, and only half filled in records and half retained records, which is pretty awful. Now, it's all happened and we can't change that now. And one of the lessons that has to come out of an inquiry like this has to be that they've got to get better.
And given the state of the records historically, do you have any reflections on how the Skipton Fund should have been operating within that context?
So The constant reference through the Skipton Fund and the EIBSS to there is sufficient evidence is really irksome when that evidence has been destroyed. You know, don't keep telling me there's no evidence. I know there's no evidence. Don't then use that for a reason for rejecting it. We need to take it as read that there's no evidence because it's been destroyed. Now we need to look at the injury and they need to look at it with due diligence. You know, they should have come back to me when I disputed them calling my break a broken wrist. I could send them a photograph of the scar. It's in the middle of my forearm. It's not my wrist. And so, you know, they could have done that and they could have asked my testimony. And I think, and a number of the panel earlier on made the same point, that the testimony of the people themselves, us, is ignored. It's almost that is taken as, let's not believe that. We were there. I was there. I know, and I still carry the scars, so I know what the injury was better than anybody. Better than anybody alive, actually, because my father is the only other person who saw that injury, because my mum never looked at it. So I saw it and he saw it. Now, they didn't even ask me any of those questions. It's almost like, this is why I used the word patronising earlier on. You know, it treats us like they know best. It's almost like getting a pat on the head. No, you just had a broken wrist. Well, actually, no, I didn't just have a broken wrist.
Having listened to the panel earlier, do you have any other reflections on what was discussed?
I don't. I mean, I think the main points I wanted to make through this were that it isn't the rejection, when there isn't the evidence. I don't know for a fact that I had a blood transfusion. Nobody knows that. And so there has to be a tolerance set somewhere, or else anybody could write in and say, give me compensation, I've got HCV. There has to be a tolerance set somewhere, but in light of the fact that everybody's data has been destroyed, everyone's records have been destroyed, that tolerance doesn't seem to be. And whether this is down to what Sir Brian said earlier on about Skipton's claim of lack of funding, whether it's down to lack of funding or whatever, there doesn't feel to me like there's due diligence around the process. There's been no effort made to fully understand the injuries or the conditions that some of the other panel described earlier on. I mean, I was quite frankly shocked by the level of evidence that some of the panel earlier today had, way in excess of mine, and they still got rejected. I was listening to them thinking, well, how on earth can they be rejected? It's obvious that they had transfusions within that time frame. And I would have, if they had explored the injury, taken my testimony about severity of the injury, spoken to paediatric orthopaedic surgeons and got a testimony from them, and they'd come back and said, no, he wouldn't have had a transfusion. I'd have said, okay, maybe I didn't. And I would have felt like it had been taken seriously, thoroughly examined, and reached a logical, professional conclusion. That's what I would have expected from a fit-for-purpose support scheme.
Thank you. Sir, do you have any questions for Mr. BD?
No, I don't think I do.
Mr. BD, is there anything else you'd like to add in relation to your evidence?
No, there isn't. Actually, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to tell my story. And it's been very interesting and illuminating listening to the rest of the panel as well.
Well, can I, for my part, thank you very much for having the courage to come and tell us what has been powerful and I think still angry testimony. And you're agreeing with that, I can see.
Yes. Yeah, the EIBSS rejection is quite recent, so that's probably why I'm still, if I talk about it, I get passionate, shall I say.
Yes, it's quite, I have the feeling it's quite raw still.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, anyway, for telling us. you've covered not only the question of rejection, but also the recent knowledge of it and recent treatment. So thank you.
Pleasure.
Now, Miss Fraser-Butlin, tomorrow.
Tomorrow, sir, we will hear from a panel of witnesses about the experiences of people with hepatitis C who cleared the infection without treatment. The people who are giving evidence are Wayne Gathercole, Marlene Neve, Kevin Roberts and Stephen Towsey.
Very well. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock.